Hi, everyone. This is Derek Harp, the founder and chairman of the Control Systems Cybersecurity Association International, or as we call it, just CSA. CSA is a 501c6 nonprofit workforce development association dedicated to helping grow, support, and sustain the professionals charged with the cybersecurity of control systems. We're specifically talking about those systems that have pumps and valves and actuators, real cyber to physical moving parts, and control nearly every aspect of our modern connected industries. Thank you for tuning into the podcast. It is my hope you find it inspirational or motivating or revealing or informative, and perhaps at times even a little entertaining. Take care and be well. Hi, this is Derek Harp, the founder and chairman of CSA and the host of the CSA podcast show. And I've got another great guest on today, Kirsch, the co-founder and chief executive officer at runZero and a longtime team member at multiple security companies, many of which you would recognize. And if you didn't know him from one of those, he's also a husband. He is a chef. He's specifically a bread baker. I love getting people sort of personal interests and hobbies out there. A runner, a social engineer, but a longtime contributor to cybersecurity and a nexus to the OT community with his latest company, runZero, which we'll talk about as we sort of go through his story. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you for having me. I've got a bread proofing downstairs right now, so I'm not lying about the bread baking.
What type of bread is it?
It's the no knead bread from the New York Times. Super easy. Like if you want to get started with bread baking, this is a super simple one. It takes all of 5 minutes to put it together, and then you wait basically half a day or a day, and then it's 45 minutes in the oven. You've got a really nice French country boule kind of bread, and it's better than anything you can buy in the store.
Well, truth be told, I need to get that recipe from you because I'd like to try it. I'm doing more cooking in my own life than I ever did before, but it's mostly started through smoking meats, and that's gotten the ball rolling. And so my wife's excited that I'm sort of tiptoeing my way into that. But it sounds like something easy to make. Like that'd be great to go with like a brisket or something.
Yeah, super easy to make.
Very cool. Well, Chris, I always start, I've got some shtick that I always say, and, the superhero analogy for cybersecurity people, every superhero, has a backstory. So where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in Germany, close to Frankfurt. My parents are both from there, and went to primary school there. Then my parents sent me to boarding school because the schools in my local town weren't that great. So I went to Switzerland first, and then to the UK. Then stuck around in the UK for a little bit for studies.
And you live now in the Northeast, right? In Boston area?
In the Boston area, yeah.
Okay. So let's sort of peel back the layers of, I'm always curious. Sometimes it's, no, not at all. It was later. Other times, like when I was 2, I was programming. When did technology cross your path?
So I begged my parents to get me a computer, I think when I was around 10 or so. And I think for my 12th birthday is when they got me one.
What did you get?
That was a Schneider CPC 6128. I think in the US it was known as Amstrad. So it was like an OEM from Amstrad. And already had a color screen. My friends only had the green screen. That was pretty much it. So I started programming BASIC on that one. That was, I think, my first foray into programming.
Yeah, well, I bet it's similar era, similar sort of things. Although if you had the color screen and I was not, it's similar enviable position. I had a 300 baud modem and I had a friend who had a 1200 baud modem.
Yeah,
that was NV Central right there.
Yeah. I think modems were not quite as popular in Germany because local calls were charged calls.
Yeah.
Right here in the US, local calls were free. So dialing to what did you call it? Like
bulletin board.
Not the ISP, but the thing before, where you just dial to another number. There's a term there that I've only heard in the US, where people have like these chat rooms or something like that are run by an individual. So you dial to somebody else in your own town and you connect there. Anyway.
I mean, the thing that we were plugging into a lot back then were BBS, those bulletin boards.
BBS is exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Those didn't exist as much in Germany, and I think it's because the lease line was unaffordable, and local calls cost you like 10 cents a minute or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Oh man, we could have a whole side conversation about that era and all the things that went on But okay, so yeah, so early interest in technology.
Mhm.
What effect did that have on your life? What did you do? I mean, and what did you decide to do after graduating, from high school?
So I was always interested in computing, and actually, when I graduated from high school, I went and studied politics with international studies. Nothing to do with computing, so I have no business being in this industry, right? But I thought it was actually really interesting, and it helps me understand some of the geopolitical aspects of cybersecurity that are really interesting. So I look at a lot of the things that are happening with Russia, with China, with Iran, and so on through that political lens and international relations lens, which is really interesting. And my hobby on the side was graphic design. So I did the school newspaper, back in Switzerland, then in the UK, and then the production for the student newspaper at the university. And so that landed me. My first job out of college was actually in an advertising agency. And what's his name? Don Draper, like this real Don Draper kind of job. I was doing graphic design for menopausal pills and hemorrhoid creams, and the directions for that, typesetting the directions for that. It was fantastic. It was glorious, right? And in the evening, I was working with a small startup. They were a technology company and were making software and so on. Then after a while, I switched to that. But that was my studies, my first job, basically.
Yeah. So does the marketing language that you used for the hemorrhoid treatments, do you ever use that to solve security problems? Is there similar language?
Well, in sales everywhere, you have to find the pain point, right?
Yeah.
I think with hemorrhoid creams, I think that's a little bit easier than with some of the cybersecurity products. But yeah.
Yeah, it's more acute, and people know where the pain exactly is. Yeah. So you landed, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first thing, maybe the first, where you firmly were in cybersecurity after that technology was PGP.
Yes. So the company I worked for, the little startup that I started with, eventually got acquired by PGP. We went through a few iterations, right? We started out with antivirus software that went absolutely nowhere. Then we actually took the international version of PGP, which was a clone of the American one, and we built an integration for Microsoft Exchange Client, which is now Outlook. It was a precursor to Outlook. And that was because this was the time of the crypto wars. So when I'm talking about crypto, I'm not talking about Bitcoin. I'm talking about real encryption, right? And so at the time, the US had laws against exporting strong crypto. So when you had Mozilla, for example, and wanted to download that in Germany, you got a weaker, like 40-bit encryption versus the 128-bit encryption that was in the US. For Outlook encryption, for anything that you could get, like you would get a weak version of the same thing. And PGP was the first product that made strong encryption available to the common citizen, especially outside the US, and they had an international version. So we were licensing that for them, then we competed with them, then they, because then the laws fell, the whole story about that. And so ultimately they acquired us because they couldn't beat us, and we were taking more market share from them in Europe than they wanted. And so that was one reason why I ended up in the US.
Well, yeah, I remember, that PGP, I don't remember started, but I think about the time you went there, I was actually in the military starting LogicKeep and attempting to use or figure out to send people communications and encrypt it, using something with an email client. And it was cumbersome, and not a lot of people participating, and how it all worked, and it was challenging in 1997. But it was fascinating to me, and I think what was that out of the U.S. was out of Silicon Valley, Palo Alto or somewhere, I think. They
were in Palo Alto, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just interesting that you were part of that and part of the European spawn of that whole thing. So yeah, that's and you were there. You had quite a long tenure from the previous company that got acquired to being there.
I think including like the whole time at PGP, including the previous company, was about 9 years or so, I think.
Yeah. Anything from that era that you think today there's like a lesson learned there or an experience there that just burned into you and is part of, maybe how you make decisions today, or things, how you look at opportunities, new technologies and how they're adopted or not?
Yeah, so two things. So one from an entrepreneurial and one from a technology perspective. PGP was really hard to use. Of course we made it much easier than, the command line version and so on. And we had our specialty was we had a hybrid client that could speak PGP and SMIME and the standard called PEM, privacy enhanced message, that nobody uses anymore today, right? And so we could send one message to recipients of all three, and we could split it up and all that stuff to make it easier. But if I now think today, like Signal, right, is a really good encryption pattern. It's incredibly easy. It still uses a lot of the same principles, but they've just ramped up the usability level so much further. And so now encryption is actually usable in the mainstream. I think back then it was really either you had to be trained by your company and they had to set it up, and the whole PKI thing. I've written more white papers and given talks about PKI and Alice and Bob than I care to remember, right? That was really complicated stuff. Now you can download Signal and pretty much like my parents can use it, and it's easy, right? And that's awesome. From an entrepreneurial perspective, two things. One of the things is the technology we once built an entire company on is now a button in Outlook. So, right?
Yeah.
So lesson learned is you always need to innovate if you want to, continue having a business, because things just get commoditized.
But that's the whole spectrum from a product category before the chasm, for sure, no chasm crossed, to feature.
Yeah.
Over a fair amount of years, but still, you saw the whole arc intimately. That is something.
Yeah. And I mean, that's like what, 28 years ago now?
Yeah.
So it takes time, right? This has been a feature in Outlook for a little longer.
Yeah.
So it's not quite 28 years, but it does eventually end up as a commodity.
Yeah.
And then there was another interesting thing of lessons learned. There was one time where we had built our entire product on a license from PGP, because they couldn't export it to us, but we could sign a contract that they would not sue us for copyright infringement and trademark infringement, right? So there's a little bit of a weird contract, but still, right? We wanted to have it for legal certainty. And so they were coming over to Europe with their business. They were able to export it after a while. And so they were competing with us, and they didn't renew the contract. And we had, our business was based on that. We basically had a UX around that crypto that they had built. And so, OpenPGP was becoming a thing. So we thought, okay, we can develop something like a clone and, market that, and we no longer have to pay licensing fees. But then we thought about how do we bridge the gap? And so we figured out that the licensing contract that we had with them didn't demand that we pay them a certain dollar amount per license or per seat, but a certain percentage. So we just went to all of our major customers, like in pipeline, not even close customers, prospects, and we said, we're going to sell you this for $1 a seat for the next year, right? And we completely blocked the market. And that gave us time to develop our own implementation of OpenPGP and bridge the gap, right? So when you're in a situation where, as an entrepreneur, you're thinking like, oh, there's no moves left, like this is destroying my business. Oh, like there's usually a move left. So if you just like dial down your stress levels and you really think it through and you look at all the options, there's usually more than one option, and just try and figure out what that is.
Yeah, great advice, great example. Something entirely different than a frontal approach. Is like, what if we did this, and it like I said, bought you time for other strategies to come into play. That's cool. Well, what was next? What after you decided to leave PGP, where'd you go?
So I went to a company called nCipher. Though they make hardware security modules, so it's kind of taking encryption keys and locking them basically in a physical box that's tamper resistant. Think of like James Bond kind of missile silo kind of thing. You need to have 2 people or 3 people coming together with smart cards to actually use the key, and that's really important for things like keys that sign passports, keys that sign other keys as part of a certificate authority, high value keys that really are the root of a trust system. And you don't want to have those lying around in software just as a file on a disk where it's easy to copy them and you can't control it. And sometimes you have systems where you need to be able to sign things, or like code signing, like you need to be able to sign things as part of a process, but you shouldn't be able to copy them. Because if you copy them, then you could sign a piece of software as Microsoft or as Adobe or as Apple and so on. So yeah, that was my only time that I actually worked in hardware, which was interesting. Quite honestly, I don't ever want to do it again, because I learned what a drop test is. It's basically dropping the box in the packaging from exactly 1 meter height. I'm sorry for Americans, but this was an international standard, right? It's not inches. And you drop that 10 times and then see if the box is still alive when you unpack it. So those were some of the issues that we were facing at the time and so on. So I never want to do software again. And also the release cycles. It's just so slow moving. First of all, you're working in hardware. And second of all, you're working with hardware that's highly certified to like FIPS and common criteria and all of that stuff. So every release, you have to put through the whole ringer of getting the certification upgrade. And it's just such a slow business. And it's very hard to expand because nobody wants to use these boxes if they don't have to. So it was just a really, really slow business. I learned a ton and it was really interesting, but yeah, I don't think I'll be going back to hardware.
It's a chapter in your book. You're like,
Yeah.
okay, I close it and move back to software. And if I'm not mistaken, that brings another well-known storied company, Rapid7.
Yes. So I was ready to leave nCipher, and I had up until that point never really interviewed for a job, because the first company, like, it was, my friend was working there and he introduced me to the manager and so on. And then at nCipher, my manager from PGP had left and she asked me if I wanted to join there and so on. But then I was ready to leave and I thought, hey, I should, I've interviewed a lot of people, but I've never been interviewed for a job. So I thought I need to do some practice interviews. And my first practice interview was with Rapid7. And
it must have gone well to go to practice, but it's also where you ended up. So
it was interesting. I mean, it was very early days of Rapid7. I think they had maybe about 70 people or so. I walked into the office and had empty pizza boxes stacked up, in the corner and all that stuff. And then I interviewed with one of the sales leaders. And it was a bit of an odd interview because he was wearing a 3-piece suit, sunglasses, and no shoes, no socks. I'm like, I like your style. This is different. And there was a reason, I think, for that, but that was interesting. And what I liked is that they seemed to be successful and they were doing things very differently and so on. And also I was interviewing for a role as a product marketing manager for Metasploit. So I had an interview with HD Moore, who's the creator of Metasploit. He had just been acquired, him and his project had just been acquired by Rapid7. And it was an open source project, of course. They wanted to keep the Metasploit framework open source. And my job was not only to take care of that community, but also then to figure out together with HD how we build a commercial product on top and how we market that and so on. Rapid7 was a one product company at the time. So all the sales pitch and the sales motion and how we invoice and all of that stuff was all geared towards one product. So when you're adding a second product, not only are you a second product, but you're changing all the processes, right? The hearts and minds of the salespeople, that they actually bring you into the conversation, that they learn the pitch, that they're talking about something that they're not quite as comfortable with as their standard pitch, right? And it's even harder when your product is cheaper than the other product, because that means they make less commission on selling you. So it's kind of like an add-on and so on. So that was a really interesting transition. And then also going from the crypto geeks, all math guys, to the hackers, which was way cooler. I mean, both sides have their merits, right? And there is a ton of really interesting stuff in code breaking and cryptography and all of that stuff. But the hackers are a little more fun to hang out with over a beer.
I'll buy that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I realized we skipped over something. You jumped the pond from Europe to the United States somewhere in there.
Yes, I did.
During the PGP years. Talk about that. I think that's also moving around this global cybersecurity economy, right? There's cybersecurity business all around the world, and there's regional differences. But you moved over and have stayed. If I'm not mistaken, you've been here ever since. Talk a little bit about that, because I think there's people wondering about moving to or from different countries within this industry.
Yeah. So if you paid attention, I moved around as a kid quite a bit. And my parents always stayed in the same place. I just went to boarding school in Switzerland, UK, studied in the UK, went back to Germany, etc. And so I was comfortable moving countries, and I find that actually super interesting and exciting. And at that point, I'd been in Germany for 10 years. And I was getting a little bit antsy. And my now husband got a job offer from a university in Boston as a postdoc researcher. And he wanted, at the time, he wanted to stay in academia. And if he wanted to become a professor in Germany, he needed a year abroad. And I'm like, this seems like a sweet gig and you need it for your resume. So like, you should do that. And I'll figure out how to get to the US. And if I can't, then just please come back after a year. And I made sure to marry him before we left, before he left. And he got on the plane to Boston without ever having been to Boston. Like, he made the decision to move there, but without ever having been there. I had been to Boston, I think when I was 7 or 8 or something like that, on a family trip, only for 3 days and so on. So I didn't really know the city, but I knew that it was more European than most of the US, and kind of a place that was a good place to land for Europeans. So a month before he had his flight over, my company in Germany got acquired by PGP. And that was my opening to figure out how to get there. The problem was that I wanted to be in Boston, and they were in Palo Alto, and they said, well, we want you in Frankfurt or in Palo Alto. We don't want you in Boston. And I'm like, well, but I want to be in Boston. That's like, Frankfurt or Palo Alto are no good for me. So I thought, okay, like, what kind of position? I was mostly in marketing at the time, and product marketing made sense because I have some technical depth and so on. So that meant I could translate between engineering and product management and marketing and the customer and so on. So I thought, okay, product marketing is in Palo Alto, so that's kind of tough, but maybe I can get a sales job, because I'd done quite a bit of sales at the startup. We were all wearing a lot of hats. And I talked to the head of sales, and he's like, "Yeah, you're not a salesperson." And I'm like, "Okay, there goes that dream." And so I printed a resume, and it was like unusual format. It was like a card format and kind of funky design, because I used to be a graphic designer, right? So I wanted to do something a little bit more intriguing, and I made it a format that fits into like a suit in our pocket at the trade show, because at the time in Germany everybody was wearing suits. I went to this trade show, and I told my manager in Germany, I told him, like, hey, I want to get to Boston. If PGP doesn't give me the opportunity, then I've got to figure out another way to get there. And CeBIT at the time, I'm not sure if you remember that show. It was like a huge IT show in Germany. I think it was actually the world's biggest, maybe next to Comdex or something. And I said, all of my contacts are there next week. I'd be stupid not to take that opportunity if I don't have an offer on the table from PGP. So I went there, and I went like to booth to all of my contacts, trying to get a job in the US. And then my phone rings, and it's the CFO of PGP. And I don't know, I must have been like the coolest person in that moment, because normally I'm a little, not that forward. But he said, like, hey, Chris, I know that you're at the show right now and so on. You're trying to figure out like where you fit in the company. We haven't quite figured that out yet, but I promise you, we're gonna find a position for you. And I told him, like, hey, Alex, that's really nice of you. I really appreciate that. But this show is only this week, and until we actually have agreed on a position, I'm just going to keep on looking. PGP is still going to be my first choice, but this is a unique opportunity for me in terms of being in the right place at the right time, right? So I hung up the phone, went around to more booths. Half an hour later, CEO calls me. Same story, same reply. And then ultimately we figured out something. They parked me under a manager that didn't make a ton of sense at the time, but I was able to work remotely from Boston. And then I had downtime in my work. And I thought, like, if I don't deliver good work or visible work, they're going to cut me eventually. So I basically said, I asked my manager for more work, and he didn't have any. So I went around and called like all the people that made sense in the company and said, I have spare cycles. Do you have any work for me? Right. And one of them took me on, and then took me into her team. And she's also the one that later hired me to Encipher. Right. So I just tried to be super proactive. And, like if I'd lost that job, I would have lost the ability to stay in the US. Right. So the stakes were pretty high.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty big experience share that you just did, because I think that's something people can think about. I would suggest not many people do what you did, but you sought out the opportunities to use extra bandwidth that you had, and of course it turned out great for you. So that's something that people can do, but it might not be first nature for people to do it. If you're ambitious and you have dreams and vision, and you want to move forward at a company and beyond that company, that's not a bad strategy.
Yeah. And it shows that you're willing to work and that you want to have an impact, right? And if you approach another manager with that message, like, who is not going to take you on? If your skill set fits.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And if they have extra work for you.
How many, just sort of make it tactical for everyone to sort of think about if they were going to do something like that, how many managers or areas of the company did you reach out to?
I mean, the ones that made sense. I don't remember exactly. Britta worked in product marketing, so that was a natural fit. I might have reached out to product management. I might have reached out to, like, I've done all sorts of things. I've done documentation.
Those people, did they all know you?
Maybe not. I don't know. I'd been to the headquarters. I'd shaken some hands and so on.
Yeah.
I also offered my boss in Germany, like, can I help you out, et cetera, et cetera. Like,
yeah,
you're just trying to, cold call, essentially.
Well, I think this is every one of these sessions, every single one, there's been what I've been coining gold nuggets. And I think that was one of them right there. That's something people could look in the mirror and say, I could do that. And if they're wanting to move up or become more valuable or make a change, but they're not unhappy with the company they work for, obviously larger company has more of this sort of opportunity than a tiny one or a small one. But all things being equal, this concept of reaching out and cold calling even within the company you already work for is very interesting. Hey everybody, Derek Harp here, and I just want to take a brief moment to thank three companies that make this podcast series possible. The first company is Waterfall Security Solutions, and they led the charge this year for the podcast, and they specifically sponsored it from their podcast, the Industrial Security Podcast. So check that out. That's a great linkage to an entire other series of over 100 episodes. They had their anniversary recently, focused on control system cybersecurity, and they were supported this year by KPMG and Fortinet. We could not do this without them. These companies not only have supported this podcast series this year, but they've supported CSAE since its very early days 8 years ago. And we're entirely grateful to the teams and dedicated professionals at Waterfall Security Solutions, KPMG, and Fortinet.
Yeah. And think about it right now, we're going through very weird economic times, and a lot of companies are laying people off or are cutting costs and so on. If you can send the signal to your company that you want to make an impact, you want to do the right thing for the company and so on, I've been through a total of 6 acquisitions, right? On the being acquired side. I've been on the acquiring side a few more times as well. And there's essentially 2 attitudes you can have to an acquisition. Either you say, like, this is BS, I don't want to be acquired, like, this is a threat to my job, all of that stuff. Or you can say, all right, this is the new reality, how can I help, right? And if you take the attitude of how can I help and where am I needed, where can I add value, there's tons of stuff, right? Product marketing has the advantage that after an acquisition, you often are retained because they're interested in the subject matter expertise and so on. And I helped rebrand the products, train the sales teams, like all of that stuff, which helps with the transition. And if you're thinking about your company right now, and maybe your company is going through a transition, think about, okay, like, what does a company need right now and where can you add value? I think if you do that, my gut feeling is it's going to get noticed and you're going to have a positive impact on your career, and you're going to reduce the risk that you're part of a restructuring. Restructuring is never great and never fair because it also impacts people that do a great job. So there's no certainty, no guarantee.
Yeah.
But in the end, somebody's going to make a decision somewhere, and if they think that you have more impact than somebody else, that might go in your favor, unless it's a structural thing where your entire department or your entire class of jobs or something is on the line.
I think this fits completely in with this theme that I've seen with a number of these interviews of people that are now in very interesting positions doing really interesting things, and people maybe early in their career say, how do people end up there? And it's about attitude and making certain choices. And I remember somebody on a recent one talking about, on my lunch break, I went over and I met those guys in the plant and learned what was going on in the plant. It's a similar thing, right?
Yeah.
Proactive, taking time that is potentially your own time and going ahead and making it happen, taking the action, and that people will be very receptive to a lot of those different things. Your example and others, they'll be receptive and say, oh yeah, come on over here, check it out. Oh yeah, let's talk about that. But it takes proaction on the individual's part. And a person who has that sort of as part of who they are, it's not surprising, that can lead to some great things.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't know what's going to lead to something great.
Yeah.
Right. So I'll give you some examples. Sometimes I have people reaching out to me on LinkedIn and saying like, hey, heard you on this podcast or something like that. Actually, real example, right? Somebody heard me on a podcast. They said, hey, this was an OSINT podcast. I'm like, one of my interests is open source intelligence, right? So he reached out and said, this was really interesting, just wanted to connect, et cetera, et cetera. He happened to live about 45 minutes from my parents. Next time I was over in Germany, I kind of like went through my LinkedIn and I said like, I have my circle of friends, but I was there for 3 weeks. So I'm like, hey, I could also see like who else I know in the area and meet up. So we met up for breakfast. This is not a work thing. We were just chatting about OSINT and techniques. He works in physical security for a big company. Used to work for a private investigator company. So like we had a really good and rich conversation. I wouldn't have had that if I just blocked him on LinkedIn, right? Another example is somebody contacted me on Twitter, like no real name, just like Ace of Spades or something like that as the name, right? And said like, hey, saw your video about social engineering. I'd love to compete in the social engineering competition. Would you be willing to have a call with me? And so I said like, sure, why not? Let's have a call. Call me on my drive home. We'll have a conversation. It's dead time for me anyway because I'm driving. I can't do anything productive. So we had a chat and so on. He was asking me about pretexting and how I figure out pretext. And I'm like, just draw from what you know about in life, what and I thought this was like an entry-level pen tester, right, that I was talking to. And I was like, okay, so what do you do? What do you do for work? Like draw on the kind of jobs you've done in the past. He says, well, I'm 16 and I'm an actor in LA. I'm like, okay, this was unexpected. But that means you can deliver a line, so that's great for social engineering, et cetera, right? But he's actually on he's an actor on a show that you would probably know. But it was a really, really interesting connection, and I've had so many of these connections where if you're open to chatting to somebody, you meet interesting people, you have interesting conversations, and so on. And many of those folks I'm still friends with today, and they've opened other doors for me that were interesting paths.
I think that's another fantastic share, which is, be open and have conversations. I think those are sort of two different themes that are related, but have conversations without knowing where they're going to lead, right? And I subscribe to the same beliefs and have the conversation. I mean, I suppose it's easy. I found my default position was I like talking to people and learning new things. If that's challenging for someone, that's hard to repeatedly do. For me, it's not a challenge. And I don't go into it with an expectation that something's going to come from it. Man, interesting things do come from some of those conversations when you least expect it, or later. Time delay, 2 years later, 10 years later, like it's so many stories I'm sure we both can share, but I love that. I think that's another really, really, really good message. So other companies, Veracode and Bridge 12 and Signals, and you start your own company. You're now more than 2 years into it, co-founder. And I think there's a theme there, probably something else you touch on, co-founder with someone you had quite a professional exposure to previously.
Yes.
So you knew each
Yes.
other, you knew what you could do together, or you had a hunch at least.
Yeah, you're referring to HD, who's the creator of Metasploit, and so we both left Rapid7 after a while, and he went off doing research and pen testing and those good things, and I went to Veracode, and we were actually both at the same pool on a DEF CON Sunday with a few other folks from the industry, and he had the idea to say like, hey, you know, like one of the big problems that is like an unsolved problem in security is asset inventory. People don't know what they have on their network. When he was doing pen tests, the stuff that they knew about was pretty well locked down, right? Not always perfectly, but you know, pretty decent. But it was always the unknown unknowns that got them owned and that he was able to use to get in. And so he said, all right, so if we think about this problem for a moment, if you look at how people are trying to solve that problem today, they're either trying to put an agent on every machine, and that agent tells you that this machine exists, or they're trying to do an authenticated scan where you need to have a service account or something like that, or some domain admin credentials or whatever to hopefully not domain admin, that would be bad, but like some kind of like maybe read-only service account that contacts every device or every IP on the network, tries to scan it, logs on, does some inventory, and records it somewhere. The problem is that with both of these, you can only inventory things that you already know about or that are on the domain, right? That you have credentials for. And we now know that about half of the devices on a network don't respond to that, right? Sometimes it's 40, sometimes it's 60%, but it's really a large amount. So he started out and said, all right, like with Metasploit does essentially four things, you know, like it enumerates things on the network, it fingerprints things, then you go to exploitation and post-exploitation. The first two steps of enumeration and fingerprinting are essentially what you need for asset inventory. But Metasploit is a little bit too aggressive a tool in terms of how it does things that it can knock things over, right? On IT networks and OT networks especially. So he created a new active scanner that is very kind to all sorts of networks, IT and OT, right? Because even on IT networks, you have like some printers spew out pages when you scan them with like a Von scanner. Some devices freeze up or reboot when you scan them with Nmap, and like all of that stuff. And Metasploit also has Nmap under the covers, right? A lot of tools have Nmap under the covers. So he created a scanner that avoids all of these problems. So it doesn't send malformed IP packets to identify Linux systems. It doesn't send aggressive security probes like SQL injections. It throttles the traffic per IP and goes round robin, so you don't overload a device that needs to respond in real time, for example, or can't process as many packets per second, right? We avoid all of these things. And then there's another way to fingerprint very, very flaky devices and fingerprint them early and then adapt the fingerprinting, right? So that I'll tell you, for example, the Lantronix serial to Ethernet converters. Like if you scan them with anything, they will throw their hands up in the air and freeze up. Because if they get a connection on a certain port, the next thing that they expect is a very, very specific command, and they will not proceed until they get that very specific command. But you can fingerprint these devices in a different way before you hit that port, right? So you take those off, like if you detect those, you don't know like, oh, this is a Lantronix, I shouldn't fingerprint this in the normal way, I'll fingerprint it in a different way. And so he started creating a product, used to be called Rumble, it's now called runZero. And basically he got all sorts of customers across tons of different industries, started in IT, but then OT customers started adopting it and saying like, hey, this actually works pretty well on OT networks as well. So that unauthenticated scan finds everything on the network and is geared towards figuring out what something is. So it goes beyond like an Nmap or a vulnerability scanner fingerprint and really tells you what the hardware is. And then we layered on top of that integrations with cloud and security infrastructure like EDR and MDM and Active Directory and so on. And now we're also releasing a passive option because there's, you know, some OT environments, like we scan a lot of, I mean, you know OT environments better than I do, but there's a lot of interesting and weird stuff out there, right? And a lot of different industries, like OT doesn't equal OT, right? So we scan anything from, with active scanning, from car manufacturing, and in manufacturing also like windows and blinds and apparel, and like, and then things like sawmills and fish farms and cattle farms and hospitals and utilities and so on, all with active scanning. But there are some customers, either the safety concerns or the age of the infrastructure or the culture or the policies that are not comfortable with that, even if they've tested it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So for those folks, we're also now coming out with a passive solution that doesn't send any active traffic, just captures the traffic on the network. And we figured out a way how to do that in software with less hardware requirements, so you can more easily deploy it on existing hardware. You can deploy it in a decentralized way rather than ferreting all of the traffic to a central location and so on. So between all of these, we're able to provide you with asset inventory across IT, both managed and unmanaged, OT, cloud, and remote, and then give you a lot of insights on security, et cetera, based on that asset inventory.
That's huge. I mean, that caught my attention when you and I first met some time ago, which you weren't doing the sort of the passive part yet.
Yeah, that's new. Yeah.
And that's new, but it's huge. I mean, even today we had one of our big events. We had a couple hundred people, and asset inventory, is discussing a variety of things, but sort of like a foundational step, like, the way I always paraphrase it to, generically is, if you don't know where your stuff is and how it's communicating, all these other strategies, are higher up the ladder, right? You got to get, I mean, that's sort of primordial, right? You got to get that done at the very early stage, and it's, I've been in, crossed over into this part of the industry from traditional cyber, 13 years ago, and there was lots of fear, and it's not dead yet, but fear around active interrogation and scanning and tools causing problems, legit cybersecurity tools causing problems in the operating technology space, all the stuff that you mentioned. But the truth is, asset inventory is a big deal. A lot of people are still struggling with that and need to know, what is connected? What are all the things that are connected? So love that's more.
And it's just and I mean those fears are not unfounded, right? If you scanned with Nmap, Metasploit, I include Metasploit in this. By the way, the creator of Nmap is an investor. Like, I think Nmap is a fantastic tool. I think Metasploit is a fantastic tool. I've worked for one of the vuln management scanners. They're all smart people, right? This is all like, these things all have their place. But their approach to network scanning can destabilize, especially OT networks, and then some IoT and fragile embedded devices on IT networks. Printers, for example, there's one vulnerability scanning solution that still fingerprints printers and then ignores them from the scan, doesn't do the remaining scan. So it just skips the printers. But we just started from scratch, and not we, because I can't, you don't want me coding this stuff. HD did. And he built a scanner from scratch that does all of this. And then, that was the hard part. That was really the part that gives you the insight into the unknown unknowns. And then we did what a lot of the other vendors do, which was the API integrations and the passive and so on. And combining all three of those, I think, is really strong, because you get a much better fidelity across different environments. You can't just take one, because you'll miss different parts of the equation if you just have one or two.
Well, I think we're nearing the end here, and I think an interesting segue is for you to talk maybe to other entrepreneurs out there, or people that are thinking about it when entering the OT space. And you're already addressing this. Maybe you'll nuance it, or maybe you'll share something different. What's important? What do the other entrepreneurs, and maybe it also extends to people who aren't the owners or entrepreneurs, but they're selling cybersecurity products. They alienate themselves in some circumstances in the OT environment when they go in and do or say certain things. I mean, do you have any advice, as people are saying, we know this is a space we want to help, but it's not just, don't jam in what you're doing or what you currently have and expect it to be successful over in this space. It may need permutation or adjustment or language, understanding maybe some additional language and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm only what, like 2.5 years into the OT space. You know,
Yeah.
used to work in other areas, as you know, and so I think number one, you want to listen, right? And that's true for as an entrepreneur, you probably want to listen more than you speak.
Great message.
Number two, hire people that know that space. We've hired people that are, you know, former operators of OT environments that know that space really well, that work with our customers in those industries and so on. That's really important. And then just study up on the space, you know, the different protocols and how you deploy things and so on. I read Pascal Ackerman's second book on, I forgot what the title is. You might have it in your head. Industrial Cybersecurity, I think it's the title. Yeah, it's over there, right? Great book. Read that between Christmas and New Year's, right? Because I was interested. You have to be genuinely interested. I think that's another thing, right? Don't chase it because Gartner says they're big dollars, but actually be genuinely interested in the space and the problems and so on. And it is very different from your standard IT network. I mean, there's lots of things that are true for both. But one thing that I always find remarkable in OT networks is that it's both the most critical system that must never go down, and it's also the most fragile thing on the planet, and you're not allowed to touch it, right? Those two things are a paradox, and it's scary when you think about it. I know that all of your listeners know this, right? But that is the one thing about OT that is I think that is one area that's difficult for some people from the outside to understand. And I think that is also because OT is something that must run and must produce value, but there is not the same level of investment, I think, in new technology in OT from a company perspective as we have on the IT side. I think IT dollars are a little bit maybe easier to come by, and probably people who sell into IT will probably say like, no, it's really hard or whatever. But it seems to me that OT budgets are overall a little bit smaller when it comes to overall technology refreshment.
Yeah, they're historically a lot of capex, bigger expense buildings.
Yeah, and they're very expensive. They're extremely expensive.
Lower OpEx that is definitely lower. But I have friends who are very much still in the field, auditing or doing assessments. And there's Windows, not only lots of XP, Windows XP out there. There's Windows 3X flavors, still there. And the tech refresh rate is wildly different, decades, versus what, 2, 3, 4 years. I don't know what the current IT refresh rate is, but it's much, much shorter. And that's not the case in these environments. And that is one of those divergent path things for sure, amongst many. Well, excited to hear more about runZero in the near future, and especially since you guys are diving into our side of the pond, so to speak, or whatever the analogy is. That sounds welcome. And let us know how we can help you. Chris, any other final words of wisdom you want to share with anybody out there? Maybe somebody earlier in their career path. What would you tell the younger Chris if you were sitting across from him?
The younger Chris. I think we talked about saying yes already, right? And not being too reserved. Like if you're struggling with saying yes and kind of jumping into situations, and if you're a little bit more on the timid side, take some improv classes. They're really frightening. As some of the most frightening things I've done in my life, maybe. And but they're really fun once you get into them, and you do it without an audience. It's just the people in the room, and they all feel as frightened as you are. But you learn going into a situation without knowing how it's going to end, and you figure out that it is fine in each situation. Sometimes the scene is funny, sometimes you completely bomb, and that's okay, right? Life doesn't end. So if you think about that mindset in life and you say, like, yes, let's have this conversation and so on, you can always walk away later if it's not the right fit, but say yes more often. And also from my perspective, I'm a very risk averse person, which probably is good from a security perspective, right? But sometimes to a fault. So I've stuck in jobs longer, and I've been more conservative on investments and so on. And arguably I ended up in a good place, right? But I always thought that I should take just a little bit more risk, not wildly more risk, not like being reckless, but more calculated risk.
Awesome. Great advice. Well, Chris, we come to one of my favorite parts of doing this. I have borrowed the what's called the Pivot questionnaire from a television show it may still be running. I really should find out, but it ran for many years, I think a couple decades, with James Lipton interviewing famous actors and actresses across the ages on his stage in front of the acting school in New York, where he was the dean. And he ended the show with this questionnaire from a French show. So I think it's decades old for sure, maybe 50 years old, I don't know. And I have not modified the questionnaire. And so if you're up for it, I'll ask you the Pivot questionnaire as our final stage.
Okay. I peeked at it. I am I'm a little bit stumped by it. We'll see how I do.
Okay. Whatever comes up first, that's
okay.
Going. What is your favorite word?
Yes. We established that, right?
What is your least favorite word?
No.
Makes sense. Goes with the opposite of yes. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
A fun challenge. So trying to dive into something new and learning about it. Yeah.
What turns you off?
People who are overly negative.
And what is your favorite curse word?
I'll go with Gottfried Stutz normal.
I gotta admit, I love
German.
it. I love it. I love it. Don't know what it means, but I love it.
Yeah.
What sound or noise do you love?
Sound or a noise? Let's think about this. I'm not very good at improv because I can't come up with anything. I will say the bing of the microwave when my lunch is ready.
What sound or noise do you hate?
The guy pulling into the parking space that I was about to take.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, I would love to be an intern for a fortune teller.
What profession would you like to not do?
God, I would hate to do any profession that is highly repetitive because I find that very boring. I love it when every day is different and a different challenge.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I think I would prefer to go to hell because that's where all of my friends are.
I'm just wrapping up with Chris Kirsch, the co-founder and chief executive officer of runZero, who gave me, again, there's always a new answer to these same 10 questions. We're approaching 100 times doing it, and I always laugh at something somebody shares. I thank you for everything, and thank you for your long-standing commitment and contributions in the cybersecurity industry. And then thanks for taking a look at steering some of that energy and activity to OT. And for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
All right. Good night, Chris.